Washington, D.C., 1859. I have always been a man of contradictions, a creature of ambition and appetite, equally at home in the halls of Congress as on the battlefield, or in the courtroom for that matter. My name is Daniel Edgar Sickles, and if you've heard of me, it's likely not from my military service. No, history remembers me first as the man who shot Philip Barton Key, the son of Francis Scott Key no less, in broad daylight in Lafayette Square. The newspapers called it the crime of the century. I called it justice. Key was my wife's lover. He had the audacity to flaunt their affair under my nose, waving his white handkerchief outside our home like some lovesick fool. What choice did I have but to confront him? A gentleman defends his honor, and so I did, pistol in hand, with the White House looming behind me. They said I was mad. My lawyers said it too, and for once, I let them. Temporary insanity, they called it. The first offense of its kind in American law, and it worked. Acquitted by a jury of my peers, I walked free while society whispered behind my back. Some called me a hero, others a scoundrel, but I've never cared much for what others think. That trial taught me something important. History is written by those bold enough to seize it. And so I seized it again when war came calling in 1861. A politician by trade and a soldier by necessity, I raised a regiment and marched off to fight for the Union cause. Not because I was a trained military man, but because I believed this nation was worth saving. Besides, war offers a man like me an opportunity to rise above scandal, to carve his name into history with steel and blood. Which brings me to Gettysburg. It was there, on those rolling Pennsylvania fields in July 1863, that my name would be etched into the annals of this great conflict. Not for my rank or my regiment's valor alone, but for a decision that would define me forever. Some call it reckless insubordination, others call it inspired leadership. As always, the truth lies somewhere in between. But let me tell you this, whatever else you may think of me, murderer, politician, general, I am no coward. When the cannon roared and the muskets cracked at Gettysburg, I stood firm amidst the chaos. And when fate came calling in the form of a Confederate cannonball, I faced it with a cigar between my teeth and defiance in my heart. This is my story, of ambition and audacity, of triumph and tragedy. Judge me as you will. History has already tried, but history doesn't know the half of it. July 1st and 2nd, 1863. The road to Gettysburg was hot, dusty, and interminable. My men marched with the weariness of soldiers who had seen too many battles and too few victories. The Third Corps was a proud unit, but even pride has its limits when boots are worn through, rations are scarce, and the enemy always seems one step ahead. Still, I rode tall in the saddle, my uniform immaculate, my hat cocked just so. A general must look the part after all. Morale is as much about appearances as it is about strategy. We arrived at Gettysburg in the dead of night, long after the day's fighting had ended. The Third Corps halted along the Emmitsburg Road, just south of the town. The darkness was thick, broken only by the occasional flicker of lanterns as couriers passed by delivering urgent messages. Reports reached us as we bivouacked. General Reynolds had been killed early in the battle, and our forces had been driven back through Gettysburg. The Union Army now held a precarious defensive line on the high ground south of town, Cemetery Hill anchoring the center and Culp's Hill securing the right. Leaving my men to rest, I rode ahead to meet with General Meade at his headquarters on Cemetery Hill. The scene was one of quiet urgency. Staff officers huddled over maps, couriers darting in and out with orders. Meade greeted me with his characteristic reserve, though his weariness was evident. "Sickles," he said curtly, gesturing to a map spread across a table. "Your corps will take position at first light on the southern end of Cemetery Ridge. You'll anchor your left near Little Round Top and connect with Hancock's Second Corps to your right." I studied the map by lantern light and nodded, though I felt a pang of unease. The terrain assigned to my corps appeared low and exposed, a poor position for defense. But I said nothing for now. Orders were orders. As I left Meade's tent and rode back to my men, I resolved to inspect the ground myself come morning. That night, I barely slept. The air was thick with humidity and the acrid smell of gunpowder drifting from the battlefield. I lay on my cot, staring up at the canvas ceiling of my tent, replaying Meade's orders in my mind. He wanted us to hold Cemetery Ridge, but how could we hold ground that offered no natural advantage? We had been poorly placed like this before, and there was hell to pay. My instincts told me we needed to move forward, to seize the high ground at the peach orchard and anchor our line there. By dawn on July 2nd, my decision was made. The morning passed in a blur of activity as I rode along my lines, inspecting positions and speaking with brigade commanders. My men were weary but determined. They trusted me to lead them well. I could see it in their eyes as they saluted or offered a quick, "Good morning, General." That trust weighed heavily on me, but it also emboldened me. Around mid-morning, I called for my senior officers to join me near a small farmhouse overlooking our sector of the battlefield. Spread out before us was a checkerboard of fields divided by stone walls and dotted with patches of woods, the kind of terrain that could either save an army or destroy it, depending on how it was used. "Gentlemen," I began, gesturing toward the peach orchard in the distance, "that is where we should be." There were murmurs of agreement from some quarters, but hesitation from others. One colonel cleared his throat and said cautiously, "General Meade's orders were clear. We're to hold this line. Gentlemen, General Meade is not here, and we cannot wait for his deliberation. These Confederate forces seek to command that rise near the peach orchard, and should they secure artillery upon that ground, they shall rain destruction upon our lines with merciless precision. We must act now, with decision and dispatch." I knew I was taking a risk. Moving forward without explicit orders would expose my corps to criticism and possibly worse if things went wrong. But leadership is about seizing opportunities when they present themselves, not waiting for permission. By noon, I had given the order. 3rd Corps would advance to occupy the peach orchard and establish a new defensive line there. As my men began moving forward across the fields, I felt a surge of pride and vindication. This was boldness in action, exactly what this army needed. We were crossing the Rubicon. As we settled into our new positions that afternoon, I took a moment to survey the battlefield from atop a slight rise near the Trossel farm. The view was commanding. To our left lay Little Round Top, to our right stretched Emmitsburg Road, and directly ahead stood the peach orchard itself, a patch of high ground that would anchor our line like a keystone in an arch. It was perfect, but war has a way of humbling even the most confident generals. By evening's end, this ground would be soaked in blood. Union blue and Confederate gray mingling together beneath shattered trees and broken stone walls. And I would find myself carried off this field, not as a triumphant commander, but as a wounded man whose decisions would be debated for decades to come. For now, though, I allowed myself one brief moment of satisfaction as I watched my men dig in along our new line. Whatever else happened today or tomorrow, or for however long this war dragged on, I would know that I had acted decisively when it mattered most. History favors boldness. July 2nd, 1863, morning to early afternoon. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and with it came the oppressive heat of a Pennsylvania summer. My men were sweating in their wool uniforms as they worked to secure our new position at the peach orchard. I rode along the line, offering words of encouragement and nodding approvingly at the progress. The 3rd Corps had moved forward without hesitation, their trust in me as unshakable as my own confidence in this decision. Still, doubts lingered at the edges of my mind like shadows creeping across a battlefield. I knew what I had done was bold, some might even call it reckless, but boldness often separates victory from defeat. Meade's orders had been clear: hold Cemetery Ridge. But how could I, or any general worth his stars, sit idly by on low ground while higher ground lay unoccupied just ahead? The peach orchard was the key to this sector of the battlefield, and I had seized it. As I sat astride my horse near the Trossel farm, surveying the forward positions of my corps, I heard the sound of approaching hooves. An aide galloped up, his face pale and voice tight with urgency. "General Meade is on his way, sir," he said breathlessly. "He wishes to speak with you immediately." I nodded grimly, bracing myself. Meade was not a man to tolerate deviations from his orders, and I knew my decision to advance the corps to the peach orchard would provoke his ire. But I had acted for the good of the army, or so I believed. Moments later, Meade arrived at a brisk pace, his horse kicking up dust as he reined it in sharply. His expression was a storm of anger and disbelief. "General Sickles," he began coldly, his voice cutting through the stillness of the afternoon, "what is the meaning of this? You were ordered to hold your position along Cemetery Ridge." I removed my hat and inclined my head respectfully. "General Meade," I replied evenly, "the ground assigned to my corps offered no natural advantage. I deemed it necessary to advance to this position to secure the high ground at the peach orchard. From here, we can command the Emmitsburg Road and enfilade any Confederate advance." Meade's eyes narrowed as he gestured toward my lines. "You've created a salient, a dangerously exposed position that can be attacked from multiple sides. Do you realize what you've done?" "With respect, sir," I said carefully. "If you wish it, I can withdraw my men back to Cemetery Ridge." Meade's face darkened further as he glanced toward the distant Confederate lines massing for an attack. Then, with a tone of resignation and frustration, he replied, "I wish you could, but the enemy will not permit it now." A tense silence hung between us as Meade turned his gaze back toward the field. After a long moment, he spoke again. "It's too late to pull back without exposing your men even further. Reinforcements will be sent immediately, but understand this. If your position fails, it will jeopardize the entire army." "Yes, General," I replied curtly. Meade lingered for a moment longer before turning his horse and riding off towards Cemetery Hill. As I watched him go, A surge of defiance welled up within me. Let him doubt me if he must. I stood by my decision. By early afternoon, my men were fully entrenched along our new line. The peach orchard formed the apex of our position, with artillery batteries placed strategically along Emmitsburg Road to cover any Confederate advance from that direction. To our left stretched Devil's Den and Little Round Top, rugged terrain that offered natural defensive advantages, but remained lightly held by Union forces. As I surveyed the battlefield from atop a slight rise near the Trossel farm, an aide approached with another message. Confederate troops were massing on our front and left flank. So it begins. I ordered my staff to prepare for an assault and rode down toward one of our artillery batteries near the orchard itself. The gunners were busy loading their pieces under the watchful eye of their captain, a grizzled veteran who saluted smartly as I approached. "General," he said, wiping sweat from his brow with a soot-streaked handkerchief, "we'll give them hell if they come this way." "I'm counting on it," I replied with a grin. Around 3 p.m., the first signs of movement appeared in the distance, Confederate skirmishers advancing cautiously through the fields and woods ahead of us. Moments later came the low rumble of artillery fire as their batteries opened up on our position. Shells exploded among our lines, sending plumes of dirt and smoke into the air. I remained mounted near one of our forward positions, refusing to show fear or hesitation as enemy fire rained down around us. A general must lead by example. If I showed any sign of doubt or panic, it would ripple through my men like wildfire. The real attack began shortly after 4 p.m. when Confederate infantry surged forward in force, columns of gray-clad soldiers emerging from the woods like an unstoppable tide. They came straight for our salient at the peach orchard while simultaneously pressing hard against our left flank near Devil's Den. The fighting quickly became fierce and chaotic as musket fire crackled across the fields and cannon roared on both sides. From my vantage point near Trossel Farm, I could see gaps beginning to form in our line as Confederate pressure mounted. "Send reinforcements to Devil's Den," I shouted to one of my aides before turning back toward Emmitsburg Road. "And tell those gunners to hold their ground no matter what." As smoke filled the air and screams echoed across the battlefield, I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and dread. This was war in its rawest form, a test not just of strategy but of willpower and resolve. July 2nd, late afternoon, the air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of gunpowder as the Confederate assault was in full fury. From my position near the Trossel farm, I could see the peach orchard, the keystone of my line, was under heavy pressure, and my men were fighting like devils to hold it. But even from a distance, I could see the cracks beginning to form. The problem with a salient is that it stretches your line too thin. I knew this when I ordered the advance, but I had gambled that we could hold long enough for reinforcements to arrive, or better yet, for the enemy to break themselves against our position. Now, as wave after wave of Confederates surged forward, I realized just how precarious our situation had become. "General Sickles." A courier galloped up to me, his face streaked with dirt. "The left flank is collapsing near Devil's Den. General Birney requests reinforcements immediately." I cursed under my breath. Devil's Den was a rocky outcrop to the left of my position, and it had been lightly held when the attack began. Now it was clear that Longstreet's men were exploiting the weakness there, threatening to roll up my entire line. "Tell General Birney to hold at all costs," I snapped. "I'll send what reserves I can." The courier saluted and rode off, but even as he disappeared into the haze of battle, I knew there were no real reserves to send. Every man in the 3rd Corps was already committed, or soon would be. The fighting at the peach orchard was growing fiercer by the minute. Confederate artillery had zeroed in on our position, and shells were exploding all around us, sending shards of iron and splinters of wood flying through the air. My staff urged me to take cover, but I refused. A general must be seen by his men, especially in moments like this. As I rode toward one of our artillery batteries positioned along Emmitsburg Road, a shell burst nearby, showering me with dirt and debris. My horse reared in panic, but I managed to calm him and press forward. The gunners were working frantically to keep their pieces firing, their faces blackened with powder smoke. "Keep it up, boys," I shouted over the din of battle. "Give them everything you've got." One of the officers, a young lieutenant barely out of his teens, looked up at me with wide eyes. "We're running low on ammunition, sir." "Then make every shot count," I replied grimly. By now it was clear that we were being attacked from multiple directions. Longstreet's men were pouring into Devil's Den and threatening Little Round Top on our left flank, while others pressed directly against the peach orchard and along Emmitsburg Road. My line was bending under the strain, but it hadn't broken yet. "General Sickles!" Another aide rode up to me, his voice nearly drowned out by the roar of musket fire and cannon blasts. "General Meade has sent word. Reinforcements are on their way." I nodded curtly but said nothing. Reinforcements would be welcome, desperately so, but whether they would arrive in time was another matter entirely. It was shortly after 5 p.m. when disaster struck. I had just ridden up to a rise near the Trossel farm, scanning the battlefield, when suddenly my horse leaped sideways. I thought it had been struck. I felt a strange numbness in my right leg, as though it no longer belonged to me. Then came the pain, sharp and overwhelming, followed by the unsettling warmth of blood. I looked down and realized I had been struck too, not just my horse. My leg was badly injured, the damage severe enough to make standing impossible. My first thought wasn't fear or despair, but disbelief. So this is how it ends? But then another thought took hold, a defiant one. No, not yet. "Help me down," I barked at one of my aides who had rushed to my side. He hesitated for a moment before obeying, his face pale with shock. I instructed them to get a strap from the saddle for a tourniquet. As they lifted me onto a stretcher, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a cigar, the same one I had been saving for after the battle. With trembling hands, I lit it and took a long drag before exhaling slowly. "Carry me off," I said calmly, "but do it slowly and let them see me. And inform General Birney he is in command now." The stretcher bearers hesitated again before nodding and lifting me carefully off the ground. As they carried me back toward the rear lines, I made sure to keep my head high and my expression composed, even as waves of pain threatened to overwhelm me. A general must lead by example, even when he's being carried off a battlefield. As we reached the field hospital near Taneytown Road, I could hear the cries of wounded men all around me, their agony mingling with the distant rumble of artillery fire still echoing across Gettysburg. The surgeons worked quickly but efficiently as they prepared to amputate what remained of my leg. "Do what you must," I told them through gritted teeth. "But make it quick." They did, I'm happy to say. Chloroform was used. When it was done, they handed me what remained of my shattered limb, a grotesque souvenir that would later find its way to Washington as part of my personal collection. Night fell over Gettysburg as I lay on that cot in the field hospital, staring up at the stars visible through gaps in the tent above me. The sounds of battle had faded into an eerie silence broken only by the occasional moan or cry from one of the other wounded men nearby. I should have felt despair, or at least regret, for what had happened that day, for defying Meade's orders and advancing Third Corps into a position that left us dangerously exposed, for losing so many good men in a fight we could barely hold, for losing my own leg in service of a gamble that might never pay off. But instead, I felt something else entirely: pride. We had held our ground against overwhelming odds long enough for reinforcements to arrive and stabilize the Union line. Whatever mistakes I had made, and there were many, I knew that the Third Corps had done its duty that day. History would judge me harshly for what happened at Gettysburg. I knew that even then, but history has never stood where I stood or faced what I faced. Let them call me reckless if they must. I know what I did here today, July 3rd and 4th, 1863. The morning after the battle dawned gray and heavy, the air thick with the lingering smoke of cannon fire and the stench of death. I lay in a cot at the field hospital near Taneytown Road, my body battered but my spirit unbroken. My right leg was gone, amputated just above the knee, and though the pain was constant and sharp, it was nothing compared to the weight of what had transpired on those fields. Gettysburg was quiet now, eerily so. The great clash of arms that had shaken this small Pennsylvania town for 3 days had finally subsided, leaving behind a battlefield littered with the dead. Somewhere out there lay the remnants of my Third Corps. They had fought bravely, valiantly even, but at what cost? "General Sickles," came a voice from the tent's entrance. I turned my head to see one of my aides standing there, his uniform rumpled and his face lined with exhaustion. "General Meade has sent word. The Confederates are retreating." Retreating. The word hung in the air like a balm for my wounded pride. Lee's army, the invincible army of Northern Virginia, was pulling back across the Potomac River, beaten and bloodied. Gettysburg was a Union victory. "Of course they are," I said, forcing a smile despite the pain. "They couldn't handle another day like yesterday." The aide hesitated, as if unsure whether to agree or correct me. I didn't give him the chance. "Help me sit up," I ordered. He moved quickly to prop me up with pillows, and I took a moment to adjust myself before continuing. "Send word to General Meade," I said firmly. "Tell him that Third Corps held its ground when it mattered most." The aide nodded and left without another word, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The journey back to Washington was a blur of pain and exhaustion. After my leg was amputated in the field hospital near Gettysburg, I insisted on being transported to the capital as soon as possible. Soon I was en route, carried in an ambulance, and once again puffing on a cigar to mask my agony. My aides accompanied me, their faces a mixture of concern and admiration, as I tried to maintain a semblance of composure despite the throbbing ache in my stump. Arriving in Washington a few days later, I was taken to a private room where I could recover in relative comfort. News of the Union victory at Gettysburg had spread, and I wasted no time ensuring visitors heard my version of events. Though controversy swirled around my decision to move the Third Corps without orders, I remained steadfast in shaping the narrative. My choice to advance to the Peach Orchard, I argued, disrupted Longstreet's attack and bought critical time for reinforcements to secure the left flank. Despite the heavy casualties my corps endured, I maintained that my actions contributed significantly to the Union's success, a contention I would defend for years to come. Then I received an unexpected visitor. "General Sickles," came a familiar voice from outside the room. A moment later, President Abraham Lincoln himself stepped inside. His tall frame stooped slightly as he entered. "Mr. President," I said, startled but pleased, "to what do I owe this honor?" Lincoln smiled faintly as he approached my bedside. "I heard you'd been wounded," he said simply. "I wanted to see how you were holding up." "Well enough," I replied, gesturing toward the stump where my leg had once been, "though I'm afraid I won't be dancing at any balls for a while." Lincoln chuckled softly, a low rumbling sound that seemed to rise from somewhere deep within him. "Well, General," he said with a sly grin, "look on the bright side. Think of all the boot polish you'll save." His tone shifted slightly as he added, "You've done your country a great service at Gettysburg. Your men fought bravely." "They did," I agreed, though there was a part of me that wanted to add, "and so did their general." But I held my tongue. Lincoln stayed only a few minutes longer before taking his leave, but his visit left an impression on me nonetheless. If nothing else, it reminded me that even amid controversy and criticism, my actions at Gettysburg had not gone unnoticed. Over the next few days, as reports of the battle filtered in and newspapers publishing their accounts of what had happened, I began crafting my own narrative. Some would call it spin. I called it setting the record straight. Yes, Third Corps had suffered heavy losses, more than any other corps in the Army of the Potomac, but we had held our ground long enough for reinforcements to arrive and secure key positions like Little Round Top and Cemetery Ridge. Without our sacrifice at places like the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, and Devil's Den, who knows how differently this battle might have turned out. I dictated letters to friends in Washington and New York, politicians and journalists who could help shape public opinion in my favor. I made sure they understood that while others might criticize my decision to move forward without orders, history would vindicate me as a bold leader who acted decisively when it mattered most. Gettysburg would define me, not just as a general, but as a man willing to take risks for what he believed was right. Let them debate my decisions. Let them argue over whether I was reckless or brilliant or both. In time, history would decide, and so would I. 1903. The train hissed to a stop at Gettysburg Station, and I stepped down carefully, leaning on my crutches. Decades had passed since the battle, but the fields remained vivid in my mind. Peach Orchard, Devil's Den, Little Round Top. Now monuments dotted the landscape, honoring regiments and generals alike. As chairman of the New York Monuments Commission, I had spent years ensuring that the sacrifices made here were not forgotten. But my work didn't stop there. Returning to Congress in the 1890s, I championed legislation to preserve this battlefield as a national military park. It was signed into law earlier this year. The park's boundaries were drawn from a map I helped create, marking troop positions and ensuring future generations would walk this ground and remember what happened here. It is one of my proudest achievements. At the dedication of a new monument near Cemetery Ridge, I sat quietly as speeches praised others. My name was mentioned briefly for my role in securing funding for the park, but no one spoke of my controversial stand at the Peach Orchard or the cannonball that cost me my leg. Still, I didn't need their words. The battlefield itself told the story. Later, as I moved through the Peach Orchard, a young man approached me hesitantly. "General Sickles," he asked, "why is there no monument here for you?" I smiled faintly. "The whole battlefield is my monument," I said, and as I looked out over those hallowed fields, now quiet and serene, I knew it to be true.